Now you can start, Rupali. Hello.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen before I start. Oops. Okay. Yeah. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can see you. Yes.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Nariman, for the invitation. And thank you all for joining this session. As you can see, this session is called "Making Home: A Case of Mumbai." And what I'm going to do is I want to make a few arguments here, with respect to housing. And one of the very first argument that I want to make is that we need to change the epistemes through which we are framing this question of housing. And let me tell you why and how. So these are some of the words, these are some of the terms that we use to discuss housing, and I think we've been sort of talking about it also in this in this workshop. We speak about it through the terms of affordability, habitability, tenure security, but one of my contentions here is that the moment you frame the idea of housing through these terms, it does two things. And I think we discussed a little bit of that yesterday as well. That one, that it turns the idea of the house into a commodity, into a tradable commodity, and it's very easy for capital to then subsume it. The second thing that it does is that it reduces it to an idea of standards. And what that standards do is that it does not allow many forms of life that are sort of built around the idea of the home through human agency. And let me tell you how, through taking you through a few cases, I'll tell you why I'm making these arguments. So my contention here is that we need to change the idea of housing and the idea of house to the idea of home, and one needs to again shift the episteme to the idea of thinking through the question of urban form. And what I'll do is I'll just a brief sort of survey take you through some of these urban forms, these house forms in Mumbai, through which I want to make this argument. The first sort of what the image that you see here is that of a fishing village. There is it's actually an agricultural village, an agrarian house, and typically that is the kind of form of the house. It incrementally grows. There is the idea of a veranda outside it, and the idea that this house is actually built, through a complicated idea of the public and the private, the idea of the increment. The house grows as the needs of the family grow. This one is a house in a mercantile settlement, a trading settlement, and typically this is series of rooms that are attached to each other, that are sort of strung along a corridor, and have common toilets. This is a house form that evolved out of a trading settlement in the inner city of Mumbai. This is again a house form that evolved around a market in the mercantile settlement. And if you look at this house form, it's this long, thin sort of finger, where a very small portion of it is facing the street and the rest of it is inside. The diverse sort of form. This is an industrial housing form that evolves out of the cotton textile mills that are situated in the city, and sort of housing that evolves out of labor coming and settling in this place. And again, if you see, there's series of these tenements with a common corridor that is strung along it, and toilets that are common. But again, very small form of the house itself, but a whole sort of life that evolves outside it. And we'll see some of that as we go along. But I'm just doing a little bit of a survey here for you to get a sense of the diverse forms of housing that have evolved in Mumbai. These were the first apartments. This is the 1920s. You had the first apartments that are set up in Mumbai. Before that, it is these kind of what were called chawls, single tenements that were along corridors. This is the first time that the apartment comes in, which has the toilets inside the house, and sort of single families inhabiting these houses. And then post 70s, you had a huge influx of migrants coming to Mumbai, and then you had public housing being set up. And again, it's the chawl type that sort of gets appropriated, but now this time there is the toilet is now inside the house. Again, 70s, there was a interesting development of what's called cooperative housing societies, cooperatives that were formed that got land from the government and people would build their own housing. 70s, you also had a huge influx of migrants coming into the city, and so a lot of housing that demands that were not met were met by self development, self housing. So settlements that we now call slums start coming up. You also have a lot of developer housing, and now this is the first time. This is post 90s. You start seeing the late 80s, early 90s. You see the figure of the developer come in. Okay, before this, you saw the cooperative societies where land was actually given out to groups of people, cooperatives, who would then appoint a contractor to build the housing. Now you had the figure of the developer who would then assemble land, who would get finances and actually build the house. And if you see this in the picture and even in this drawing here, these are parcels of land, which are agricultural land on which this housing sits, actually quite awkwardly sometimes, because often you have a kind of main road that is built, but the kind of right of way to some of these houses have to be negotiated from within the plots. But this is the kind of laissez-faire development that is coming in, where developers are now sort of facilitating this kind of development. And of course, then you had the same kind of smaller developers consolidated into larger developers who had the means to sort of have larger amounts of capital, who could then build, who could amass larger portions of land and build these kind of, large townships, gated communities, and these kind of high-rise developments in the city. And then you had other forms. You had informal land subdivisions that happened, where self-built settlements would come in and sort of through small informal means of sort of subdivisions get access to housing. And then you had these kind of transit housing as well coming up. And then again, other forms of luxury apartments and these kind of this is the house of one of the richest persons in Mumbai. It's actually a house of one family, the Ambanis. So this is a kind of broad survey of housing in Mumbai. But again, now I want to talk about the second section is called economy and house form. And we see how economic shifts in the city have also shifted the form of the house. So you saw this, the top portion, you saw some of this, but you see that from an agrarian economy, moving on to a mercantile economy, moving on to an industrial economy, and the idea of finance, where finance becomes important in the sort of economic setup, you see this kind of shift of housing. Now, actually, very interestingly, Mumbai, which is actually the financial capital of the city, is losing some of that focus of being the financial capital. A lot of jobs are now moving out of Mumbai. They're moving to newer places like Gurgaon and Delhi, to other countries. And so that kind of advantage that we have, the financial capital is shifting. And one actually really needs to think of what is this new form of housing that develops. Another thing that happens in the 90s is this kind of dismantling of the industry. Where, you saw that industry.
Excuse me, Rupali, does it sound somehow with your voice that is not so very clear now? I don't know.
Can you hear now, Nariman? Is it clear now?
Yeah, now it's clear. It's better.
Okay. So, you saw that form of industrial housing that came up out of a consolidated form of industry. And there were landlords who would then build this form of housing. Slowly you start seeing the dismantling of the industry. Now no longer in the 90s, you start seeing that industries are closing and people are in the industrial form of work itself starts fragmenting. Okay, it starts moving to different parts of the city, and people have now become entrepreneurs. So instead of a kind of regular job of 9 to 5, you now have fragments of those jobs happening in different places, and people have taken up the entrepreneurship of that, of those jobs which are now fragmented. So a lot of people are now no longer, and again this is in the 90s, the government shifts its kind of role from being a provider of housing to a facilitator of housing. So it starts sort of giving incentives to developers to build housing, and is no longer building its own sort of housing for low income groups. So at the same time, you're also seeing a huge proliferation of slums, of self-built housing, because there's a large gap in the demand and the supply. Also, where is very interestingly, you see the family, the form of the family is constantly shifting along with the house form. So again, if we see the central part, you had large agrarian families that sort of lived in that. Also fishing. Okay, there are two forms of either agrarian families. There are people who are involved in fishing, and they have a very very different kind of family structure that sort of inhabits this kind of house form. Slowly you had the shift of focus to kind of a mercantile economy, with the colonial administration actually inviting a lot of traders to facilitate mercantile trade in the city. So you had this kind of house form that evolved. In the 50s, you had the cotton textile mills set up in the city, and you had a lot of migrants who came from the hinterland to stay in the house. And these are very 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 typical families. I mean, these are actually not families initially. These were single men who were living in these houses, and often a large number of people, sometimes even around 15 to 20 people, would share this one tenement. But the way they would do it is that they would work in shifts. So they would be working in the mills, and then 1/3 of them would always be in the house. But what happened during holidays? During holidays, they would all be inside. But then the way they actually kind of lived was that they spent a lot of time outside. So the city became home. Okay, the city developed a huge culture of sort of city life around theater, around sort of inhabiting the streets, around festivals, and that's how the idea of the home starts taking place. And this is where I want to kind of talk about the idea that you can't think of the idea of the house as just that commodity. The idea of the home is much more than the house itself, that square meter area of the house. Again, you have in the 90s, you start seeing the shift to entrepreneurship, and you had settlements, these kind of self-built settlements. One thing that you saw in the self-built settlements was that there was very little unemployment. Everybody was employed. Okay, and the house actually also doubled as a workplace. Because it had that particular form, it also allowed the kind of the increment of the family. So you could put a loft above, you could sort of expand your house above. And then at the same time, you had the developers actually coming up with this idea of the nuclear family house. So that was the only imagination that the market comes up with. But the forms of the family actually are multiple. It's not that single family, nuclear family. There are groups of friends staying together. There are single parent families. There are all kinds of diverse families. But that is something that the market house just does not acknowledge. And now actually you're seeing a very very interesting shift. It's a shift, a demographic shift, where people are growing older, but the market actually hasn't shifted the idea of the home. It is still building large high-rise apartments, which are absolutely not conducive to the idea of the elderly, or even acknowledging this kind of multiplicity of families, of single parents, of groups of friends, of migrants living together. So that's something that we will see as we go along. Okay, now I want to introduce two other terms. Okay, two other terms through which we can shift the epistemes through which we think of the housing question. And this is the first term that I want to introduce is transactional capacity. And let me tell you what that is. So if we look at this, this is the kind of plan, a development plan of the city of Mumbai, and you see that these are made of single lines, right? Single lines, polygons through which you understand the idea of a plot, a kind of idea of property, the idea of a building. But if you actually look closer into that line is actually not a single line, but it's a blurred line, it's a corroded line. So that one single line that you saw on the plan would actually be 4 or 5 of these layers. You have that the chawl house that you saw earlier, you have a shop below, you have an extension of the shop, and then you have these little things which we call 1 foot shops. It's a property that is only a foot deep, okay? And that is a kind of a shop that actually pays a little bit of rent to the house, the shop at the back. Sometimes there are kinship relationships between them, and then there's a whole range of hawkers that are outside here, and sometimes it's also the homeless who take care of the of all of these wares in the night. Sometimes some of these wares are stored in the kind of house here above, and so there's a series of relationships that are built between these different people, and the form of the house actually accommodates that. And this is again where the blur sort of holds complicated tendencies, where many people are able to exist together. So, for example, if you see the central image, it's a very interesting image where there is a shop inside a shop, a typist shop inside a lawyer's shop, okay, a lawyer's office. And again, this is the kind of complicated tendency which is impossible to be recognized by these new forms of neoliberal planning, which which seeks for clarity, that says you need a very clear GIS map, where you ease governance, and you say that you start assigning ownerships to properties. That's impossible to do in situations like this, where you have a house inside a house that is taking place through a very different form of kinship relationships. That's a house, that is a shop under a staircase. That's one of those 1 foot shops. Again, this is a self-built settlement in Behrampada in Mumbai. And if we look at very closely this idea of occupancy, you have a grocery shop below, you have an embroidery unit, a worker's dorm, the owner lives here. There is a shop that rents out large utensils to make biryani during festivals. Again, another embroidery unit above that is a library, and right above that is a community space, and a mosque, actually a prayer hall. And all of these kind of exist in this self-built settlement, this kind of diversity which is almost impossible to see in other forms of living. Again, this is just taking you through another house form. This is one of those stalls that you saw before. It's a single tenement, it's a single room, with often toilets, sort of common toilets outside. And these ideas of these corridors that are in the front, they're at the back, and then these little bridges that connect these two bars. Okay. And what that does is that these are the bridges that you see in the drawing here. What that does is that it actually creates a whole sort of living room where the house is no longer this single unit, but it's all of this. It's the whole building becomes the home. And so you'll see some of these images. These are the corridors outside. These are some of the bridges where people spend time. They sort of spend a lot of their time outdoors. These are the corridors that are facing the street, and you find often a lot of this kind of furniture that is lying around, this kind of orphan furniture, which at some point people even forget whose it is, and it sort of becomes this kind of the idea of commons. It becomes a kind of common property that is used almost by everyone. This is a family, this old couple that has been living in this house for a very long time. And the reason, and this old man is actually ill. He's been sort of ill for 3 years, and the reason they can actually exist here is because, again, that tenement is that small tenement, but it is a porous house. Okay, I like to call it a porous house. It's open on both sides. The door behind and the door in the front, and people sort of move around, they say hello to them, they walk in and out of the house, and in the absence of state social security, these forms of living become forms of security. So these are, I mean, this is the door, and actually, if you see this door, this is the a shutter of this cabinet in the kitchen, which at one point in the daytime it sort of keeps this door open and it shuts the kitchen cabinet. But in the night, this thing closes and it shuts. So this kind of multifunctional object that allows this form of opening and closing of the home. And I think this is what, and we call these transactional objects, that sort of allow a certain form of living. And that's a drawing where you start seeing this idea of the bridge inhabited and how the entire building becomes the home. But when you see this is the way these fabrics in the city are transforming. This kind of housing is transforming into these high these towers, and these settlements, self-built settlements, are becoming buildings like this. The cooperative societies that you saw before are turning into these high-rise towers, and this is because in the 90s the government sort of took back its role of being a provider to becoming a facilitator, and it started giving incentives to developers to actually build this kind of housing. They allowed them to build more than the stipulated amount of floor area in the on a plot, on a single plot. So typically you would have, in something like this, you would have the tenants of that house living till the lower stories, and then the above stories become for that are sort of sold in the open market for that subsidize that house. But typically when something like that happens, often you find that these are not affordable anymore for the tenants, because in something like this, which was low rise, the amount that you would pay for maintaining a property like that is much lesser. Whereas in this, you have elevators, you have all sorts of your electricity bills are much higher, your water bills are much higher, and invariably it leads to a form of gentrification, a kind of soft gentrification, because people cannot afford to live there anymore. They sell off their houses and go away. Similarly, in sort of settlements like this, when they turn into this, again they become unaffordable maintenance wise. But also in both these cases, you find that the form of living, which was what you saw before with these kind of transactional capacities, that you would have that form of extended living where you would really sort of live with many more people, this which would actually also become a kind of unit of work, is impossible to do here in this kind of settlement. Also, when the cooperative society, which was this kind of communal living, shifts into this high rise, often you find, particularly the older people, women, who feel like they're trapped inside the house. There is no extended form of living anymore. And this is typically, again, what is happening to, this is the way that the slum is being redeveloped. Also because it's a kind of market-led redevelopment. A lot of incentives are given to developers, and one of the incentives is also to relax the norms of setbacks that would give you light and ventilation. So you see this kind of housing, it's only 3 meters apart from each other, and these are 14 stories, 24-story buildings with very very little light and ventilation, and almost no forms of sort of transaction that happen. There are boundary walls that actually get formed, that sort of create this idea of cellular living that threaten that kind of corroded, blurred logic of the city that we saw before. These are resettlement colonies that are even worse. These were actually in situ. These are places where the slums are built in the same place that they were in before. But these are when you have pockets where infrastructure projects are going to come in, where families are moved to peripheries of cities, and again you find this kind of housing coming up with very very little light and ventilation between the buildings. And these actually places have now become sites of very very high tuberculosis cases of tuberculosis, because of the kind of conditions that are being set up. And mind you, this is perfectly legal because they follow all the bylaws that are stipulated. And so this is the argument that I want to make, that from the incremental settlement to this kind of skyscraping apartment, you have transactional capacities which are I define them by the densities, number of activities that you can do per unit space, networks, livelihoods, cultural settings, security, accommodation of diversity. All of that is much, much higher in the incremental settlements. The degree of blur is much higher in the urban form, whereas towards the skyscraping apartments, this kind of degree of blur drops, but also what drops is your transactional capacities. What increases is the amount of resources that they consume, which is much lower in the incremental settlements and much higher in these kind of redeveloped settlements. And again, what is also increasing is the kind of cellularization, the kind of atomization of life that is increasing in these forms of living. The second concept that I want to introduce is the idea of settling. Okay, the first was the idea of transactional capacities. The second is the idea of settling, and it's an interesting way of thinking of housing. Again, this is a case which was a kind of toilet that was built right in the middle of a slum settlement, and it was the slum sanitation project that was instituted by the World Bank. This has been done in many parts of the world, where one of the arrangements was that an NGO and a contractor had to come together to build a toilet facility in a slum, and they would get a lot of finances from the municipality and from the World Bank for doing that. And so you see that this was in a place in Govandi in Mumbai, where a kind of a toilet was built, and one of the things that they had to do was they had to have a caretaker. Now, this caretaker often became an interesting figure. In this particular case, this was the caretaker who started slowly, incrementally, sort of building around that toilet. He made a kind of place, the caretaker had a very, very small space. He built this larger kind of community hall along with it, all built by his own resources. Did the flooring in the house, did a kind of, railing. This is he bought a air curtain, okay, an air curtain, which is typically something that you get in a mall, which will stop the flow of air from a large space to the outside. He bought that. The first time we met him, it was on a chair and sort of became a fan in that kind of large space. The second time you went, you could see that he had a stand on it and it was set up and sort of consolidated further. The next time there was a landscape outside it, and then at one point he set up a conference with small contractors who were actually building the settlement around, and one of them pointed us to this house here, which he had newly built, and he said, I have solved the problem of ventilation in this house. Now I have a roof which sort of floats above and creates this kind of clear story, which allows the kind of air to move, and it's much nicer being in this house, and it's a nice blue house now, right? So I mean, this is the kind of the idea of settling is sort of important, because the idea of incrementality actually creates a kind of form of living which does not endanger the kind of forms of living, forms of human agency that have already been set up. And okay, I'm going to move ahead. And this is again now this idea of the slum, and really what do we call a slum? And I think if you look at it, sometimes it's the visuality of the slum, right? Which is really something that we sort of take for granted, as this idea of poverty, the idea of dirt and filth and squalor, and something that many of us do not want to engage in. But if you look closely, and this is sort of the definition of of slum in Maharashtra, okay, and let me just read that the area is or may be a source of danger to health, safety, or convenience to the public of the area or of its neighborhood by reason of the area having inadequate or no basic amenities, or being insanitary, squalid, overcrowded, or otherwise. The building in any so the building should be either in any respect should be unfit for human habitation by reasons of dilapidation, overcrowding, faulty arrangement of design, narrowness or faulty arrangement of streets, lack of ventilation, lack of sanitation facilities, etc., etc. Okay, I mean, this is the definition of a slum. And what it says is that a competent authority, generally the collector, is authorized to declare an area a slum. And now, so this is the ambiguity of it, that there is a competent authority who will declare it a slum, and there is nothing to do with the tenure. Okay, nothing to do with legality that is there in this definition. Okay, now what that does two things. One is that I mean, I showed you some of that housing before, right? Some housing which is so close to each other that it is, there's no light and ventilation. There are cases of tuberculosis in this place. And I think that is much more of a danger to habitation than the kind of settlements that we saw, where there was very, very high transactional capacity, and forms of living where people were able to live, subsist, and sort of go about their everyday lives. And so, what do you then define a slum, right? So this is the danger that one actually starts seeing, and one actually starts. I mean, I think it's possible to rethink that sort of idea of the slum through forms of habitation which bring in dignity. And I'm going to take you through some of the cases, and we'll come back maybe to this definition. And so if we look at very, very closely some of the slum settlements and what they have been doing through human agency, this is a slum settlement that is along the waterfront, okay, the eastern waterfront of Mumbai. What it does is that it's actually all built on these stilts that allow the water to come and go. And if you look at closely, there's a little balcony that is there. People have actually through their own agency created a kind of house, and slowly upgraded the house to make it habitable, to make it sort of livable. Again, you saw this, all the forms of life that were there in Berampada. We saw that before. This is in a potter's colony in Dharavi, where you see that there is a house here, but there's a road here, there is a shop, there is a place where they make these pots. These are the pots that are being made. There is a kiln at the back where the pots are burnt. So all of this, like you saw it multi-storied in Berampada, here you see it sort of horizontally stratified, and a kind of form of life that is affirmed in this kind of form of living. And then, of course, you see enterprise, you see little cinema theaters that have come up in these places, and all kinds of forms of life. This is in Dharavi, which is one of the largest recycling industries. There's this kind of place where they're making food items, which are then sold to different parts of the city. Highly, highly productive. And this is, again, I just want to show you this kind of diagram which shows that in the 90s, this kind of black box, this industrial economy that we had, sort of very clear the idea of raw material to kind of last the production in the end, started getting fragmented. Okay, it started fragmenting, and it was now being taken up by series of these entrepreneurs who would navigate the cities in very, very different ways. And they actually found these kind of forms of occupancy in this elastic sort of form of in this corroded, blurred, logical form of the city. Okay. Okay, now this is my last section. This is the last section that talks about ways in which this kind of, some of this housing or house can be thought of in sort of, in taking its next step or its of improvement. And if we see this, there are 6 grades that I have sort of laid out here. One is upgradation, a reconfiguration, a kind of idea of redevelopment, and all of these 3 are in the case where they are in situ, they're redeveloped in the same place. This is resettlement, where it is not possible to resettle people in the same place because there is some kind of city infrastructure that has to come up in this place. And so you have this idea of site and service, you have this idea of a shell and service, and the idea of a high rise. And so let me take you slowly through each of them. This is the first case of upgradation. And you see that, in this case, Again, it was the same case of the slum sanitation project, where the NGOs and contractors actually built large infrastructure projects right in the middle of the city, of the slum. But there were small contractors, actually lower level uh, 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 people in the municipality, who actually did not have a lot of stakes like the large NGOs had, and they worked with small contractors to actually sort of lay infrastructure in this slum settlement. They had a septic tank outside, and they put pipes, outside, and then left it up to the houses. And then houses actually spend their own resources to build these little individual toilets inside the house. What that did is that it actually completely changed. This is the way the settlement became, that it became a much nicer settlement, and there was a lot of dignity, because you no longer had to go outside, to the toilet and sort of stand with a little pail of water, waiting in line. It was the worst for women, because women had to wait until the men went for work, and then they would go and use the toilets. And so now there was this complete this form of dignity, where people had their toilets inside their own houses, and often a lot of standards were sort of change around. Sometimes you had a little trapezoidal toilet inside the house, because that was the space you had. But it was so much nicer to really have that toilet, and the settlement now became like a little village settlement, where you had your house, you had the space outside, and form of life that was possible to sort of inhabit. So, and this is another project that we did ourselves once in one of those resettlement colonies. There was a little shed that was there. We upgraded that into this kind of community space, where you would find that this is a play school happening, a library. So kind of upgradation that has sort of created a kind of infrastructure, that made that sort of extended the idea of the home to this community space. And we found that people spent a lot of time outside here. The second is this idea of, okay, I'm going to have to go slightly faster, this idea of in situ. And this is actually not a case of Mumbai. This is in a city called Nanded in Maharashtra. But again, this is interesting because it created very little disruption. Okay, these were the houses of the slum, and these kind of small roads were built, and very small, sort of the houses that were moved were actually stacked up above. So there was this kind of reconfiguration that was created, which actually created very little disruption of the existing housing, which normally happens when a slum is redeveloped. And so this is the kind of before and after of the case. This was the place, the roads were slightly widened, and then you had the houses stacked up. This is a multi-story development. This is typically what happens, that the slum is moved into this kind of place. Often this is the sale part. I showed you the form of the house that gets developed, that very little space is left between the two, and typically sort of occupies a very small part of the plot of this house. And this is the slum settlement. So, for example, this one is this very, very schizophrenic form of house, where the plot was very small. There was a slum on it, and the part at the back you see is the slum redevelopment, and in the front is actually a hotel. So you see this very fancy, steel and glass and this kind of cladding on the house, and the back is actually the schizophrenic form which is left. Often they don't even want to show that, so sometimes there's the access is completely different, and this kind of segregation that happens between the two, this kind of split that you see between the two forms of living. Yeah, so this is typically the sale building. This is what it looks like, and this is the slum building that is redeveloped with these two buildings next to each other, and very, very, very small space between the two. Yeah, this is actually transit housing. Very interestingly, this was an NGO that had tried to build this kind of transit housing, where all they did was increase the floor height a little bit and created an extra mezzanine floor, which also became a place which became an extra bedroom at times. It became a place where sometimes work would happen, so a tailor would locate her sewing machine up there and create a little workspace. And all that they did was increase the floor height a little bit. Now, a lot of developers did not like this, because if that would be allowed, then they would lose an entire floor. And so the developers preferred much lower floor heights, and so they did not allow this kind of housing to actually become part of the bylaws. Resettlement. This is again an interesting form of settlement that has happened in Mumbai, the idea of site and services, where people were given these kind of pitches of land and were organized around these courtyards. Again, what it did is that it sort of, this is the close up of it. It created these streets, it created courtyards where a lot of life could actually be led outside. A lot of the entrepreneurs that we saw in the previous images actually could live in places like this, because they could extend their form of living to the outside. This is the courtyard. These are the courtyards that came up. But again, this was in the mid 80s. In the 90s, with the birth of the developer, this was all crushed. So these were again pitches of land that were given to people. Yeah, and these are the slums that come up. Okay. Now, resettlement. Resettlement, you'll see some of these cases, and actually the architect Charles Correa has actually presented a lot of cases of the idea of shell and services, where this is the artist's village, and these are proposals that he's made in many places. The idea of providing a shell which allows for incremental kind of development to happen, okay, where it's possible that the house actually can grow. I'm just going to go faster because I think I'm coming to the end of it. The resettlement, high rise, this is what we've seen already, this idea of high rise, which actually does not allow a lot of transactional capacities to take place. Also, this kind of the outdoors is something that is almost missing, though people with their agencies will create a little bit of this, open a little window outside, try to do what they can, but the house form itself does not allow that. And of course, these are neglected spaces, so sometimes these are these are some of the worst spaces, sewage flowing around here, spaces that are that are actually nobody's land, and so not cared for. Yeah, I mean, these are again other cases where Korea has actually presented ideas of actually some of the high-rise buildings starting to get some of these transactional spaces at higher levels over here, but this is a scheme that did not really happen. Again, shell and services and multi-storied houses. These are again not in Mumbai, but these are cases where in other parts of the country, these kind of experiments of mid-rise development have happened. But again, you see, and this is something that doesn't happen in Mumbai again, because under the pretext of not having enough land, you see that people, the bylaws for setbacks are relaxed, and everybody goes for the minimum setback. So you will never find this kind of land, this kind of housing in the present resettlements. But what I want to compare is this in a typical format that is here. You will see that the same amount of land that is occupied by this kind of housing can also be occupied by the site and services that we saw before. And the site and services that we saw actually allows so much more of the transactional capacities that we have seen before. But somehow in our imagination, in this idea of providing housing like this, this form of living has actually sort of completely taken a backseat. So yeah, this is it. Now I just want to compare this last table, where from the idea of upgradation to the idea of high rise, as you sort of move in the upgradation actually is least disruptive to the community, because everyone is allowed to kind of live there. In the redevelopment, the amount of disruption is the largest, because often what happens is in the redevelopment, and this is again something I forgot to mention, that the developer is given the right to develop, The developer is given an incentive to kind of build, for the open market, and for in return for that, they have to give the houses free of cost, but they have to build only for the so-called legal people. And now legal people are the people who are able to provide the right documents, okay, that show that you have been in the city, prior to a certain cutoff date that the government has stipulated, and other things. So you often find that people do not have these kind of documents, are not easy to have and maintain. And so a lot of people are thrown out of the housing market because they just do not have the right documents. Okay. So it kind of creates a huge amount of disruption as it sort of goes towards this multi-story development. Complexity is much lower, expenses are much lower, the complexity of the situation rises and expenses rise as you go here. Similarly, in the kind of case of resettlement, in the case of sites and services, your disruption is the lowest, the disruption is the highest in the case of sort of high-rise buildings. The complexity is lower here and the expenses are much higher here. So this is something that we've been trying to propose, that as far as possible, use the option of upgradation, use reconfiguration if upgradation is not possible, and in places where it is possible that the communities are smaller, where disruption may not happen. As far as possible, avoid the multi-story redevelopment. In the case of resettlement, again, we say use resettlement only if in situ option is not possible. Use site and services, shell services for local investment and incremental development, and as far as possible, don't go for that high-rise development. So this is something that we've been proposing, but we also find, and okay, this is another very, very interesting statistic, the housing problem, and this is, if you see that, in the last 20 years, we've been the demand for housing is actually 13 lakhs, and we've been able to, with all the policies in place, with all the kind of incentives given to developers, the amount of housing that is built is only this much, 2.73 lakhs. And this is, I mean, what I want to say is that in the last 20 years, we've built very, very less. This is only this much. And if you actually project that, the amount of lakh that we have today, if you project that, it will take 109 years to build only for the present demand. This is the absurdity. This is the absurdity of the demand and supply, given the present sort of market driven, incentive driven housing that we have. And which is why what we have this is why we've been sort of pushing for the idea of upgradation. And this is again kind of from the slum census, what we find is that actually there's almost everyone has a house. Okay, it's not that people are homeless. The shortage of housing is actually 1.74%. Okay, because most of the people have houses, and the census also says that many of these are in good living conditions, livable. And so, this is something that we are proposing, that if just to kind of fill that gap and not have that absurdity, one actually needs to look at upgradation in a much more serious way. But this is something, again, that is a reality in India, that because of the way we think of housing, we do not have the policies, academic courses in architecture, engineering, planning do not have courses that deal with upgradation, nor are there standards in place or tendering processes that kind of deal with this idea of repair and retrofit and improvement. And so this is something that we've also started in a big way in the school. We've introduced a course on repair and retrofit, and in many ways, sort of through policy, also trying to push this idea of repair and retrofit, and also through some architectural practices. And you saw one of those community centers too there. So yeah, with that, I'm going to end, because I think I'm sure there will be questions, and I would like to have an interaction here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rupali. That was a very interesting lecture presentation for me, and that was very interesting. This different layer in the same housing for me. I mean, because of fire protection, I think in Austria it's not possible to build these buildings, but I remember that is really very interesting. Yeah, these settlements. Just a moment, maybe we have already the Alex. Okay, this 100,000. Please, yeah, write your question in the chat. You find it
Is the chat?
at the top.
Yeah, I'm trying to go to the chat. Just trying to find the chat. Um, yeah, sorry. Yeah, 1 lakh is 100,000. Thank you. Thanks, Ian.
Rupal, you have also the first questions in the chat.
Yes. First question is, can you please detail the cooperation between developers, NGOs, or other stakeholders? What is their role? Okay. Okay. So, different cases. I'll tell you in the case of housing. In the housing, like I mentioned a little bit in the presentation, since the 90s, the government has actually taken a backseat in the provision. Until the 90s, they would actually provide housing. Okay. And often you had, there were categories like low income groups. They would call it an LIG housing and an MIG, a middle income group, and a higher income group housing. But they actually built housing. Okay. In the 90s, they realized that they did not have funds, or at least they claimed to not have funds, and so they started facilitating. They became facilitators of housing, and so they developed policies. So all kinds of policies came up. Policies for slums, which said that developer could come in and sort of if there was a piece of land where on which a slum sat, the developer could actually build sort of rebuild this entire slum. It had to sort of take away all the slum settlements. It would have to build free of cost for what they called the legal tenements. Tenants. They would have to make a pro forma that sort of listed all the people who had all the documents. This would have to go to the municipal corporation. People would be approved or disapproved, and then they would provide that kind of housing. In return, they would get to build more than what was stipulated to be built on a plot of land. Okay, and this they would sell in the open market. Now, in most cases, they did not build in places where market rents, kind of value was low, and so they actually, they only built in places where there was really high real estate. And of course, you saw the form of housing that came up that absolutely had nothing to do with the form of living. It relaxed all forms of light, ventilation, and all kinds of things in that form of living. NGOs also in the 90s, you'll see that NGOs also became developers. So at some point, it was very difficult to kind of understand, to sort of distinguish between a developer and an NGO. They also started building similar kind of houses, so the early NGOs actually did things like they made the slum census. They were involved in forms of upgradation and all kinds of things, which takes actually much more effort. In the 90s, it sort of shifts, and almost NGOs almost start becoming indistinguishable from developers. So I think that's the kind of, and in the case of the toilet that you saw, again there was that case of an NGO and a contractor that had to come together, but they actually landed up building these large infrastructure projects which were actually very visible. And you have to understand this kind of politics of funding, that you really have to make sure that what you do is really visible, that it is on pamphlets, it's on things that you could share on your website. And that's what gives you more funds, right? International funds and other things. So no one actually went for individual toilets, because that would a not make a lot of money for them, and b was not this kind of visible infrastructure that you could show around to funding agencies. And on the other hand, smaller level municipal staff who had very little stakes and had much more relationship to contractors on ground and to the community people, actually built these individual toilets inside houses. They didn't make a lot of money on it, because there was nothing, there was little money that could be spent on the laying of infrastructure in the community outside, which could be done through small contractors. And people, as and when they had their own money, would invest in their own into houses, into their own toilets. So these are kind of the relationships between developers, NGOs, and other things. If that answers your question. Um, okay, I think there's another. Thank you for the. My question is: by force, people should live and move to high-rise flat. So, what should people do to bring back transactional space that happened before? Okay. Okay, there are two parts, I think, to this question. One is by force, people moving to high-rise apartments. Yes, it happens because there's a lot of arm twisting that happens. Developers are often very, very interested in not in rehousing people, but in that on that piece of real estate that the slum communities are on, which is sometimes in places of very, very high real estate value. Okay, so there's a lot of developers come in and sort of arm twist people to do that. But a lot of slum communities have actually realized that this is not something that that affirms their form of living. A lot of their work and other ways of life get sort of scuttled, and so a lot of people are actually also not also resisting it. There was this I mean, we've been working with a slum community in Bandra that actually sort of said, we don't want to go with the developers. We want to kind of form our own cooperative housing society, like they did in the 70s, get the land from the government and actually build their own sort of houses. So yes, you're right in the sense that the people have to move to this kind of housing sometimes by force, because often there's a lack of imagination, there's a lack of agency, but there are also instances where people are resisting that. And of course, in the sense of once that kind of high rise is built, you see that, I mean, even in the worst case scenarios in the resettlement colonies, if you go today, I mean, now we are, because we've been going there since 2005 when these resettlement colonies had come up. These were places of very, very high alienation. And now you will see that just through sheer human agency, a lot of these are now turning into transactional spaces. People are sort of combining things, making temples and mosques inside the houses. They're making exercising spaces and sort of libraries and other things in these places. So people do that, but I mean, if you look at this idea of settling, it takes much longer for things like that to settle. And of course, infrastructure wise, it's much more difficult for spaces like that to I mean, sort of, it's, you saw those images of sewage and everything, because these are now not something that you could do through small contractors. You require much larger engineering solutions to deal with that, which is why I mean, that's why that last chart where I said, discourage as far as possible high rises. But if you can, then you start, I mean, if they become about, then you start forming ways in which transactional capacities can happen. And that kind of that image that you saw of that little community space where we upgraded a kind of small shed, what is actually one of those examples of places of a high rise resettlement, where you start creating these transactional spaces where the idea of the home is extended to. So yeah. um Transactional capacity seems like a great concept to bring the sense of home to habitants. However, the term slum is declared to certain spaces that allow it. Are there any indicators in Mumbai for space to be declared so? Yes. Yes. So, like I said, that definition is a very ambiguous definition, and it is up to the collector, okay, what they call, who they call a competent authority, to declare a place a slum. Often, slum dwellers are actually also interested in getting their own areas declared as slums, because then you have to pay less tax. You also can get infrastructure in places, and this is again something that is important because in 1976, this is 1976, the Slum Act actually allowed for, I mean, we speak about the idea of tenure security, but a form of the Slum Act actually gave all slums that are declared slums a form of tenure security, because you, once a slum is declared a slum, you cannot evict it. Okay, so people actually try to, through the competent authority, get their areas declared as slums, because it is possible to upgrade them once they are declared slums. Okay, so that's the kind of the logic of declaration of the slum, and it's possible, but this is the thing that, it's not gone beyond. It sort of works with, very very low level of politics of corporators and others who, do a favor to slum communities, that they'll go and lay up, road somewhere, lay a pipe somewhere. But we really require many more sort of forms of kind of regulations and standards to actually work with these places, because this route is a much more interesting route, and it's possible to actually make dignified homes through this route. Okay, I'll just go to the next question. Are there differences in interventions that follow some religious divide, like Muslim, Hindu, or others? What about Kerala? Is it really slum free? Okay. Um, Differences in interventions that follow religious divide. In many ways, actually, if you see that, I mean, I think the 90s in Mumbai particularly was a sort of watershed, because you had a lot of, I mean, we had riots, okay, in the city in the 90s, and those riots actually caused a lot of, reconfiguration of living. I mean, these are Hindu-Muslim riots, and people actually were very very scared to actually live. I mean, there were a lot of them were mixed communities. There's a lot of, but I mean, people actually live together, but a lot of people actually moved after that, particularly Muslims who were minority. Minorities in these places actually moved to places, where they were actually, they started living together. So there was a kind of ghettoization that happened. Often you find that, I mean, I think this is something which is one of the slum communities that we've been working with in Bandra. I mean, they realize the importance of this community of staying together for a form of security. And so this is actually one of the reasons why they have, resisted the developer. They want to kind of form a community, a sort of upgraded form of community, but sort of want to live together. So yes, I mean, I think there are differences sometimes between the way communities deal with it. Some of the ones that have higher resources actually go in for the developer kind of housing, because a certain mobility that you get, you are able to transact that house, you are able to get a bit of money from it. So some of those people who have with higher resources actually go for the developer form of housing. But in a kind of larger, on a larger kind of basis, you'll find that a lot of them actually are not able to even sustain that house after a point, like we saw, because the maintenance is higher and all of that. And so people actually land up selling some of those spaces and coming back and living in resettlement, in sort of self-built settlements. The other thing that you see is that there's a huge social problem, that one thing that kind of people go for the developer housing because suddenly it gives you a lot of money in your hand. Okay, but socially, a lot of times that money is lost very very quickly because you would spend it in a kind of marriage. You would get a daughter or a son married, and you would spend all of that money. Or you would sort of buy a large vehicle because that's kind of something that would give you social status, and you would spend that money very very quickly. And sometimes with that amount of money that you get, it's not possible to kind of get a house in the space that you were living in, so you would move further north in a city where you would all your forms of sort of social networks and all of that existed in this part of the city that you are living in are all snapped. So in some way or the other, it sort of causes a form of gentrification and a kind of shift of the form of life that you were otherwise living in. Kerala, what about Kerala? Is it really slum free? Now, one of the things that is happening in a lot of places in smaller cities in Kerala, in Karnataka and other places, there is this idea of the Mumbai model. Okay, the Mumbai model, which is started just like we had so many different forms of housing that we saw in the first survey, but in the 90s that got scuttled by this kind of developer housing that came up and almost took over all our imaginations, right? And so in the same way, a lot of housing in other parts of the city are being hijacked by the Mumbai model, whereas actually, I mean, if you see Kerala and many other places have had many more interesting traditionally interesting forms of sort of living. But yes, Kerala is much more, I mean, in terms of they've been able to deal with this idea of settlement in much more diverse and much more interesting ways than Mumbai has. Uh,
Rupali, excuse me, Veronica has also a question.
Okay, sorry, did I miss that? Where
Our
is that?
government?
Oh, Veronica. Sorry.
Yeah.
A great presentation. I'm interested in on how reconfiguration going, how long government succeeded in convincing the public to do reconfiguration and how to engage them. Okay. Now, yes, thank you. Thanks for that question. Now, reconfiguration is again something that is not very easy. Um, that particular case that you saw in Nanded was a very interesting case of reconfiguration where it actually happened, uh, in a kind of liminal state, before the policy changed, the land policy changed. So this was a time when, there was almost sort of no policy on that land, and it was about to change. And this is where this kind of the local government and an NGO sort of got together and created this kind of reconfiguration, on the land. So I mean, it's a very interesting case again, which is why I come back to the fact that we do not have very clear policies for repair, retrofit, reconfiguration. A lot of these happen on project basis. Okay, they happen on sort of case by case basis where some policy somewhere will be mobilized, and you would sort of build this kind of housing through mobilizing some policy somewhere. But we really require much clearer ways of actually looking at some of these cases of reconfiguration and upgradation in much clearer ways. So yeah, Veronica, I hope I answered your question. Um, okay, Charlene, is there any development for mixed use after resettlement to those tower building? Also, are people willing to move to those towers, or are they forced? Then what happens to the people after their resettlement? Yeah, I think I've said some of this. Mixed use, yes. Like for example, in a resettlement, if you have a shop, you will get a shop. Okay, you will get a shop. You will be compensated by a shop, not by an industrial unit. Okay, because industrial units are not allowed. So if there is an industrial unit, if you have put a little say printing press or something in your place, you would not get compensation for that, but you would get compensation for a shop if you have it. Now, again, this is where the idea of the urban form becomes important, because often in this new reconfiguration of the form of the house, you would have a shop, somewhere at the back, of the street, where there is no street. So you would have the shop, but you would not have any customers because there is no longer access. Yeah, because what you're doing is you are providing these kind of standard apartment types where you would have a shop on the ground floor, and then your residences are above. But in that reconfiguration, in that you have not thought of urban form. And so when you've not thought of urban form and provided these kind of standard housing, most of these shops in the redevelopment fail, because they are no longer conducive to this kind of idea of transaction. So yes, people are willing to move to towers. Like, again, I said, sometimes they move because you would get money for it, and it is something which is tradable as a commodity, but it doesn't work in kind of long term ideas of living. Niputu Tani, hi, great person. Transactional capacities. Oh, I think I've read that. Have I read this? Transactional capacity seems to be a great concept to bring the sense of home to how a term is declared. Yeah, I've read that. Okay. Okay, I think this one, right? Ian, thank you for the talk. Do you think we need something like a new collective imagination that creates a broader understanding of what living in the city actually means? We were in Mumbai twice with our students and saw some great ideas created by single organizations, but it is not trickling down to the policies, etc. Do you think more media-based lobbying for ideas would create more impact? Maybe architecture school should produce a Bollywood movie with your students. Yeah, definitely. I think we need all kinds of ways in which this idea kind of has to come in. Actually, there's a very interesting Bollywood film. If you have seen it, it's called Kala. Of course, I mean, but what is interesting in that film is it sort of captures a lot of politics and this kind of forms of living, which are very, very interesting. But yes, I understand what you're saying. I mean, it's not a film that sort of is something that you would show to policymakers and other things. But yes, definitely. I mean, we have been the last 3 years we've been producing a course on repair and retrofit. We are also trying to sort of take it outside now to we've been doing it in the school with students, but we want to take it outside to different places now. Through our different individual capacities, we've also been working with, in fact, one of my colleagues worked with the Karnataka government to work on this kind of housing policy, which brings in repair and retrofit and reconfiguration in much stronger ways. So yes, definitely. I mean, we need many ways in which this sort of trickle down happens. Yeah. Is there any building code to regulate the space between high rise for housing? Yes. There is. So there are building codes for regular housing that sort of regulates the space between housing, that ensures light and ventilation. But like I said, in the case of slum housing, it has been relaxed, which is why, and I mean the reason that is given is that it makes it more feasible for the developer to take it up. But in some ways, I mean, it doesn't work for in many cases like we saw. Thanks, Daphne. What do you think about transactional space, the condition about social distancing right now? Okay. Yes. That's the question that many people have been asking. Transactional capacities, how does that work with the present COVID-19 situation? Now, see, this is again where I think it's important to start looking at the idea of not a house but a home. And this is, I mean, particularly in India, we've been sort of, the lockdown has been a complete failure. The government has been speaking to people saying, stay in your homes. That's the only way. but in most cases there are no homes to stay inside. Yeah, you don't have a home to lock yourself into. The idea of the home was always this idea of the extended home. Now, this is again where we need to also shift our imagination of the home from the lockdown unit to perhaps an idea of a neighborhood. Like it's possible to start thinking of many scales of, even in a reconfiguration, you need to start thinking of the home at various scales. And if the home is a safe place, can an extended idea of a home be sort of thought out, which is that safe space? You know, so I think it's important. And for example, if you saw in the case of that the chawl house that we saw, which is with the bridges outside, with the corridors outside, that was an extended form of sort of living. And it's possible to think of a larger community which which is part of the home, which starts taking care of each other, but also takes all the kind of precautions that you would otherwise take, in a home. And I mean, the whole thing with the virus is that has itself blurred the idea of inside and outside. The virus can come inside your home through whatever. It can come through a package that is delivered to your home, through your commodities that you get in, through all kinds of means. All you need to do is really take a little bit of care. So if you can take care in a kind of lockdown unit of home, you can take care in a slightly larger, sort of enlarged idea of the home. And so I think this is something that we've been also thinking about. Can you shift the idea of 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 the house to the idea of a home in a neighborhood? You know. So of course we have. I mean, these are very new situations. We have many things to think about. But I think there is a possibility of thinking of the idea of a safer neighborhood rather than a kind of atomized, lockdown unit of the home of the house. Hans, I've already asked this above. On the case of Mumbai, which political parties stand for which informal settlement policies? Can you draw a distinct line between right and left wing, conservative and progressive positions and actions? Who are the main political actors in Mumbai informal settlement replacement nowadays? Okay, now. The thing is, it's not so clear. It's not so clear. It's much more fuzzy, because it's actually the people who work on the ground with communities, and this is done through many different kinds of mobilizations, both left, right. It's not so clear. Okay, there are many people who work in the ground, and communities are also very intelligent. I mean, they're not people. I mean, communities also mobilize a certain kind of politics depending on the kind of groundwork that happens with people who actually work with them closely. Yeah. And so like you saw in the case of I mean, this is again something that has happened, uh, not only with political parties but with NGOs. There are political parties who are actually on the left, but who have actually distanced themselves with people, from people. And so they have actually sort of gained a kind of higher ideological position, but at the same time lost the footing on the ground. And this is where a lot of slippages happen, where people who are parties that are progressive but have also in some ways started aligning with developers, and sometimes it's the other way around. So it's very nebulous. I think the ground is kind of much more nebulous than we can imagine. I think what is important is, again, also in the case of NGOs, we've seen that, like we saw in the case of the toilet project, that sometimes the NGOs become very elite, so they lose the focus on the ground. They become much more professionalized. They start sort of, working with the idea of actually delivering a certain project, and so completely lose out on what would be the larger life cycle of a project. Yeah. So I think this is something that I mean, this is the way I would really answer you. The ground is a messy place, but the messiness has its agency. Yeah, it's not so clearly divided between left and right, and sort of progressive and conservative. And I think that that's where you really need to operate. You need to operate on the nuances and the messiness of the ground, because a lot of emancipatory possibilities lie there. Thanks. Is there any question, Nariman, that I have missed?
I think from Kshatriya have a vivo war.
Okay.
How
Yeah, yeah.
difficult?
How difficult to communities invited to move to new settlements? How difficult? Like again, I think I have answered this a little bit in a previous case, that many times communities do move easily to new settlements because they're able to transact that house, to kind of monetize it very easily. But in many cases they don't do it as well, because they realize that, particularly in cases when they have complex forms of occupancy, when they have work and live happening in the same place, when they have larger communities that are sort of together, because of all kinds of, because of religious reasons and other things, they need to sort of stay together. There are many instances where communities have actually resisted this form of sort of moving to new settlements. But equal number of people who have actually done that. They've sort of used this facility. They have monetized the house. They've moved, but in many cases that has failed for them, because in the longer run they have had to sell their houses and move back to these places, because because they could not afford to maintain them, and B, because a lot of their own forms of living, of work and other things did not happen in these places. So they have ultimately sort of sold that house, and sort of also in many cases lost the money that they got, or in the long run.